Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a journey into one of history's most misunderstood eras. Tonight, we're going to experience what it was really like to be wealthy in medieval Europe, roughly from the 11th through the 15th centuries. But forget the images of noble lords feasting in candlelit castles, ladies in beautiful gowns dancing at balls, and wealth meaning comfort and security. That's not our story tonight. Our journey takes us to medieval Europe, when being rich meant you were a feudal lord, a wealthy merchant, a high-ranking church official, or perhaps a successful knight. This isn't the romanticized version of courtly love and chivalrous nobility. This is the reality, the constant threat of violence, even in your own castle, the infections from minor wounds that killed you despite your wealth, the food that was elaborate but often made you sick, the marriages arranged for political gain with spouses you'd never met, and the understanding that wealth couldn't buy you clean water, effective medicine, or protection from the plagues that killed rich and poor alike. Before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. And if there's another historical topic you'd like me to explore, let me know. Your suggestions shape these journeys. Now, let's step into a medieval castle and discover what it really meant to be among the privileged few, in an era when privilege meant something very different than today. If you were born into nobility in medieval Europe, let's say France or England in the 13th century, your wealth was measured primarily in land, not money. As a feudal lord, you controlled estates that might encompass several villages, thousands of acres of farmland, forests, and perhaps a castle or fortified manor house. The peasants who worked this land owed you labor, crops, and various fees. On paper, you were wealthy and powerful. In reality, you lived in conditions that a modern middle-class person would find intolerable. Your castle, the symbol of your power and wealth, was fundamentally a military fortification, not a comfortable residence. The stone walls that protected you from enemies also made the interior cold, damp, and dark. Castles were built for defense, with thick walls, narrow windows, and minimal concern for comfort. If you lived in a castle in England or northern France, you were cold most of the year. The massive stone construction absorbed cold and never truly warmed up, even with fires blazing in the Great Hall. You wore multiple layers of wool and fur clothing indoors, and you still felt the chill in your bones. The heating in your castle was minimal and ineffective. You had fireplaces in the Great Hall and perhaps in your private chamber, but these heated only the immediate area around them. The smoke from fires had to escape through the ceiling or through primitive chimneys, so your rooms were often smoky as well as cold. The tapestries that hung on walls served partly as decoration, but primarily as insulation, attempting to reduce drafts and retain some warmth. You went to bed under piles of furs and heavy blankets, and winter mornings meant waking in a room where you could see your breath. The sanitation in your castle was primitive despite your wealth. You had a privy, essentially a hole in an exterior wall that dropped waste into a pit or moat below, but it was cold, drafty, and unsanitary. Some castles had multiple privies at different levels, sharing a common shaft that emptied outside. The smell was terrible, especially in summer. You might have had a chamber pot for nighttime use, emptied by servants in the morning. Bathing was infrequent, perhaps once a month or less, because heating enough water for a bath was labor-intensive and the castle was too cold to bathe comfortably. You and everyone around you smelled of sweat, smoke, and unwashed bodies. The food you ate was abundant and varied compared to what peasants ate, but it was far from the gourmet feasts that movies portray. Medieval cuisine was heavily spiced, partly to mask the taste of meat that was starting to spoil, partly because spices were expensive status symbols. You ate a lot of meat: beef, pork, mutton, venison, various birds, often roasted or boiled. But the meat was tough because medieval cattle and sheep were smaller and stringier than modern breeds. The preservation techniques, salting, smoking, drying, made meat even tougher and saltier. The bread you ate was made from wheat flour, a privilege since peasants ate coarser grains. But it was dense, heavy, and often contained impurities from the milling process. Fruits and vegetables were available, but considered less prestigious than meat. Your diet was actually nutritionally unbalanced. Too much meat and salt, not enough fresh produce, and deficient in vitamins that you needed. You might have suffered from gout, painful inflammation of joints caused by high meat and alcohol consumption, which was so common among the wealthy that it was called the disease of kings. The wine you drank at every meal, water was unsafe, so everyone drank diluted wine or ale, was often sour or wine preservation was imperfect, and once a cask was opened, it deteriorated quickly. You drank it anyway because the alcohol made it safer than water, but you developed a taste for wine that modern people would find undrinkable. The quality varied enormously, and even wealthy nobles often drank mediocre wine because production and storage techniques were primitive. The medical care available to you despite your wealth was worse than useless. If you became ill, the physicians you could afford, the most educated medical practitioners, treated you according to the theory of 4 humors, believing that illness resulted from imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Their treatments included bloodletting, cutting you to remove excess blood, purging, giving you substances to cause vomiting or diarrhea, and applying leeches. These treatments weakened patients and often killed them faster than the original illness would have. If you were injured, say, in a tournament or a battle, your treatment was crude surgery without anesthesia or antiseptic technique. The surgeon might cauterize wounds with hot irons, creating terrible burns on top of the original injury. Infections were common and often fatal. A minor wound could lead to gangrene and death within days or weeks. Your wealth couldn't buy you antibiotics because they didn't exist. Many nobles died from infected wounds that modern medicine could treat with a course of penicillin. The dental care you received was minimal. Tooth decay was common because the medieval diet included honey and dried fruits, sweet foods that promoted cavities. Tooth extraction was the only treatment for serious decay, and it was done without anesthesia by barbers or blacksmiths who doubled as dentists. You lived with chronic tooth pain, or you endured the agony of extraction, or you lost teeth and struggled to eat. By your 40s, you might have lost several teeth and had others that were rotting in your mouth. The childbirth that your wife faced was extremely dangerous despite your wealth. Noble women had access to midwives and perhaps physicians, but these attendants had limited knowledge and no effective interventions for complications. If labor went wrong, breech presentation, placenta previa, hemorrhaging, your wife would probably die, and the infant too. Maternal mortality among noble women was perhaps 1–2%, lower than among peasants because of better nutrition and rest during pregnancy, but still horrifying by modern standards. You might have married multiple times because your wives died in childbirth. The infant and child mortality in your family was heartbreaking despite your wealth. Perhaps 20–30% of children born to noble families died before age 5, from diseases that modern medicine prevents or treats easily: measles, scarlet fever, dysentery, infected wounds. You and your spouse expected to lose children. It was normal, accepted as God's will. You might have had 8–10 children born, with 4–6 surviving to adulthood. The grief was real, but you couldn't dwell on it. You needed heirs to continue your lineage, so pregnancies continued despite the losses. The education you received was better than peasants got, but still limited. If you were male, you might have learned to read and write Latin, studied some mathematics and logic, learned horsemanship and weapons training, and absorbed the codes of chivalry. If you were female, you learned household management, embroidery, perhaps some reading in vernacular language, and how to behave as a noble lady. University education existed, but was primarily for those entering church careers. Most nobles received practical education focused on managing estates and fulfilling their social roles. The marriage you entered was arranged by your family for political and economic advantage, not love. You might have met your spouse once or twice before the wedding, or you might have married a stranger. Love was not expected. It was considered fortunate if it developed over time, but marriages were alliances between families, not romantic partnership. You married to produce heirs, to unite estates, to forge political connections. Your feelings about your spouse were secondary to these practical considerations. The violence that threatened you was constant despite your castle's walls. Medieval Europe was fragmented into countless competing lordships, and warfare was endemic. Your neighbors might attack to seize your land. Bandits might raid your estates. Political conflicts could drag you into wars that devastated your holdings. Even times of nominal peace saw constant low-level violence, raids, kidnappings for ransom, murders over disputes. Your castle protected you somewhat, but sieges could starve you into submission, and treachery from within was always possible. The tournaments that you attended or participated in were less romantic contests than Hollywood suggests. Knights fought in armor, weighing 50 to 60 pounds, wielding weapons designed to kill. Tournament sports included jousting, where knights on horseback charged at each other with lances, and melee combat, where multiple knights fought. Serious injuries and deaths were common. Knights were killed by lance strikes, trampled by horses, or suffered fatal head trauma through their helmets. You participated because it was expected, a way to demonstrate prowess and gain honor. But you knew it was genuinely dangerous. The crusades that might call you to war were religious expeditions, but also opportunities for younger sons to gain land and wealth they couldn't inherit at home. If you joined a crusade, you endured months-long journeys to the Holy Land through hostile territory, fighting in brutal heat while wearing armor, facing enemies who used different tactics than European warfare prepared you for, and confronting diseases like dysentery that killed more crusaders than combat did. Many crusaders died before reaching their destination. Others died in battles or sieges. Few returned wealthy. Most who survived came home poorer than when they left. The Black Death that struck Europe in 1347 or 1351 killed perhaps 30–50% of the population, and your wealth provided little protection. The plague was indiscriminate. It killed nobles and peasants, clergy and merchants. If you were wealthy, you might flee to remote rural estates, hoping to escape the contagion that ravaged cities. But plague spread to countryside too. You watched family members develop the horrible symptoms: fever, chills, swollen lymph nodes, buboes that turned black and oozed pus, delirium, and death within days. Your physicians were helpless. Your prayers seemed unanswered. You might survive while your spouse and children died, leaving you traumatized and alone in your castle. The subsequent plague outbreaks that recurred every decade or two throughout the later Middle Ages meant you lived with constant awareness that the disease could return. Every rumor of illness in a nearby town created panic. Every unexplained death raised fears of plague's return. You might isolate yourself and your household at first signs of outbreak, but isolation was imperfect and plague often found you anyway. The psychological toll of living under this threat was severe. It fostered fatalism, religious extremism, and sometimes scapegoating of minority groups blamed for the disease. The church's power over your life was absolute, regardless of your wealth. You were expected to attend Mass regularly, confess your sins to a priest, and support the church financially through tithes and donations. Your salvation depended on church sacraments, baptism, communion, last rites, and the church claimed authority to excommunicate you, which meant eternal damnation. Even as a wealthy noble, you couldn't openly defy church teachings without serious consequences. Heresy accusations could result in your lands being confiscated and you being burned at stake. The religious obligations that structured your year included numerous feast days, fasts, and holy days. Lent meant 40 days of restricted diet, no meat, limited quantities, which you observed because failure to do so was sin. Friday was meatless throughout the year. Major feast days required your attendance at lengthy church services. You donated to monasteries, funded church-building projects, and perhaps went on pilgrimage to demonstrate piety. These obligations consumed time and money, but they were non-negotiable because your eternal soul was at stake. The monasteries that you might patronize or where you might retire in old age were centers of learning and prayer, but also austere communities. If you retired to a monastery as a lay brother, common for widowed nobles, you gave up your wealth and worldly possessions to live under monastic rule. The discipline was strict. Regular prayer services throughout day and night, manual labor, silence during most hours, simple diet, and celibacy. For some, this was appealing spiritual life. For others, it was grim ending to years of privilege. But the alternative, dying in sin without final reconciliation, seemed worse. The courtly love traditions that poets sang about were literary fantasies with little connection to reality. The idealized knight serving his lady, performing heroic deeds in her name, loving her chastely from afar. This was entertainment, not description of actual relationship. Real noble marriages were contractual arrangements. Adultery happened, but it was condemned by church and could have serious consequences. A noble woman caught in adultery might be imprisoned, sent to a convent, or even killed. A nobleman's adultery was treated more leniently, but still created problems if it produced illegitimate children with inheritance claims. The succession disputes that plagued noble families were vicious conflicts that could destroy dynasties. Your eldest son inherited your title and primary estates, but younger sons received lesser inheritances or nothing. This created resentment and sometimes outright warfare between siblings. If you died without clear male heir, rival claimants, cousins, nephews, even distant relatives might fight for your estates. These succession wars killed nobles, devastated lands, and enriched lawyers while impoverishing families. The Wars of the Roses in England, the struggles over French territories, these were fundamentally inheritance disputes among nobles. The taxation that you owed to your king was irregular, but could be ruinous. Medieval kings had limited regular revenue and funded wars and administration through special taxes levied on nobles. If your king decided to invade France or fight off invaders, you might be assessed a hefty tax, perhaps 10 or 20% of your annual income, that you had no choice but to refusal meant being branded traitor. The taxes were unpredictable and could come at bad times when you'd already suffered crop failures or other losses. Being wealthy meant being a target for royal taxation. The military service you owed your king was feudal obligation. You were required to provide armed men, knights, and soldiers drawn from your estates for royal wars. This meant equipping and paying these men, which was expensive. You might be required to serve personally for 40 days per year, bringing your own armor, weapons, and horse. If wars lasted longer, and they often did, you either paid scutage, money instead of service, or continued serving at your own expense. The obligation was burden that consumed wealth and risked your life. The merchant class that emerged in later medieval period represented different kind of wealth. If you were a successful merchant in a city like Venice, Florence, or the Hanseatic League towns, you were rich in liquid capital, money, and goods, rather than land. You lived in a substantial townhouse, not a castle. You wore fine clothes, ate well, and enjoyed urban amenities. But you faced different challenges: risk of losing ships to storms or pirates, business deals that might fail, creditors who might bankrupt you, and social stigma from landed nobles who considered commerce beneath their dignity. The banking families like the Medici in Florence accumulated vast wealth through lending money to kings, popes, and nobles. But banking was dangerous business. Debtors might refuse to pay, wars could disrupt trade routes, and church prohibition on usury, charging interest, required creative accounting to avoid heresy accusations. The most successful banking families essentially bought their way into nobility through strategic marriages and political influence, but they remained somewhat outside the traditional noble hierarchy. Their wealth was enormous, but unstable. Fortunes could be lost as quickly as they were made. The guilds that controlled urban crafts and trades were oligarchies that protected wealthy masters while exploiting journeymen and apprentices. If you were a guild master, a successful goldsmith, cloth merchant, or similar craftsman, you had substantial wealth and political influence within your city. But you were constrained by guild regulations that controlled prices, limited competition, and enforced quality standards. You couldn't expand your business freely or innovate without guild approval. The wealth was real, but circumscribed by collective regulations. The fashion that displayed your wealth was elaborate and expensive, but often physically uncomfortable. If you were a noble woman, your dresses were made from silk, velvet, or fine wool, dyed with expensive colors like crimson or purple. But the dresses were heavy, restrictive, and difficult to put on or remove without servants' help. The fashionable silhouette changed over time, sometimes requiring tight lacing that constricted breathing, sometimes requiring heavy padding that made movement awkward. You wore your wealth literally on your body, but the display came at the cost of comfort. The jewelry that you wore announced your status, but also attracted thieves and raiders. Gold chains, rings with precious stones, brooches, and decorative belt fixtures were wearable wealth, easily portable and convertible to cash if wearing expensive jewelry in public made you target for robbery. Nobles traveling were sometimes ambushed by bandits attracted by visible wealth. Within your castle, you were relatively safe, but traveling meant balancing display of status against risk of attack. The entertainment available to you was limited by modern standards. You had minstrels and troubadours who performed songs and stories, jugglers and acrobats who provided variety acts, and perhaps plays performed by traveling companies. But entertainment was infrequent and repetitive. Most evenings involved conversations with family and guests, perhaps games like chess or dice, and then early bed because artificial lighting was expensive. The illumination from candles and oil lamps was dim and created eye strain. You retired at dusk and rose at dawn because there was little else to do after dark. The hunting that you engaged in was both sport and food gathering. Nobles hunted deer, boar, and birds in forests they controlled. Hunting was restricted. Peasants who hunted were poaching and could be severely punished. The sport was dangerous. Boars could kill hunters with their tusks. Falls from horses caused injuries, and arrows sometimes hit fellow hunters accidentally. But hunting was expected of nobles. It demonstrated mastery of martial skills in peacetime and provided fresh meat for feasts. You hunted regularly despite risks because it was part of noble identity. The falconry that was popular among nobles required substantial investment and skill. Training a hawk or falcon took months of dedicated work. The birds were expensive. A good hunting falcon might cost as much as a horse. You wore a leather glove to protect your hand from the bird's talons, carried the bird on your arm, and released it to hunt game birds. The sport was prestigious, but required constant attention. The birds had to be fed, trained, and cared for daily. Falconry was as much about displaying status as about actually catching birds. The literacy that educated nobles possessed gave you access to books, but books were rare and extremely expensive. Before printing, books were hand-copied by scribes, and a single book might cost as much as a farm. Your library might contain a dozen books, religious texts, classical works, perhaps some vernacular literature. You treasured these books and read them repeatedly. The emergence of printing in the 15th century began to change this, but for most of the Middle Ages, owning books was privilege of the very wealthy and institutions like monasteries. The legal system favored nobles over commoners, but was still capricious. If you were accused of a crime, you might be tried by your peers, other nobles, rather than in common courts. But the legal procedures were influenced by political considerations and personal relationships. Trial by combat was sometimes used to resolve disputes. Essentially, whoever won the fight was declared right. Trial by ordeal, where the accused was subjected to physical tests like holding hot iron, was believed to reveal guilt or innocence through divine intervention. Justice was neither blind nor fair by modern standards. The debts that you accumulated could destroy your family despite your wealth. Noble households ran on credit. You borrowed against future income to fund current expenses. Military campaigns, building projects, lavish hospitality, and ransoms for captured relatives all required borrowing. If crops failed or revenues declined, you might be unable to repay loans. Creditors could seize estates. Some noble families fell from wealth to poverty within a generation because of accumulated debts. Managing finances was constant struggle even for the wealthy. The dowries required for your daughter's marriages were financial burdens. A substantial dowry was necessary to secure good marriage alliance, but providing dowries for multiple daughters could bankrupt a family. Some nobles sent daughters to convents rather than marry them because the convent dowry was less than a marriage dowry. This wasn't necessarily religious calling, but economic calculation. Your daughter's marital prospects depended partly on how much wealth you could provide, which created pressure to accumulate and preserve wealth. The ransoms that might be demanded if you were captured in warfare could bankrupt your family. Capturing nobles for ransom was common military practice, more profitable than killing them. If you were captured, your captors would set a ransom based on your estimated wealth. Your family would have to raise the money, often selling land or borrowing heavily. King Richard I of England's ransom in 1194 was 150,000 marks, roughly 3 times England's annual revenue, and had to be raised through heavy taxation. Even lesser nobles' ransoms could be ruinous. The financial impact lasted years or even generations. The servants that staffed your household were numerous but not always trustworthy. A large, noble household might employ dozens of people: cooks, servers, grooms, guards, chambermaids, and various other servants. You depended on them for daily functions, but they saw and heard everything in your household. Secrets were hard to keep. Servants might steal, might gossip, might betray you to enemies. You had to maintain authority through mixture of patronage and intimidation, rewarding loyal service while punishing misconduct harshly to maintain discipline. The privacy that you enjoyed was minimal even in your own castle. Noble households were communal. Servants, guests, and family members were always present. Your great hall was public space where petitioners, servants, and guests mingled. Your private chambers offered more seclusion, but servants entered frequently to tend fires, bring food, or perform other duties. The concept of privacy as we understand it, being alone and unobserved, was rare luxury. You were always on stage, performing your role as lord or lady in front of an audience. The warfare technology that evolved during the Middle Ages made castles increasingly vulnerable. Early castles with wooden palisades were replaced by stone structures with thick walls. But siege weapons improved. Trebuchets could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, battering walls. Mining techniques allowed attackers to tunnel under walls and collapse them. Eventually, gunpowder and cannons made even the strongest castles obsolete. By the late 15th century, castles offered limited protection against determined attackers with artillery. The military advantage that had justified castles' expense and discomfort was disappearing. The political intrigues at royal courts were dangerous games where nobles competed for favor and influence. If you were ambitious noble, you sought position at court as royal advisor, military commander, or courtier. Success brought rewards, grants of land, lucrative offices, marriage alliances. But court politics were treacherous. Rivals plotted against you. King's favor was fickle, and today's favorite could become tomorrow's exile or execution. Court required constant vigilance, skillful flattery, and willingness to betray rivals. Many nobles preferred their rural estates to the stressful intrigue of court life. The executions that befell nobles who fell from favor were public spectacles meant to demonstrate royal power. Being executed as a noble meant beheading rather than hanging, a mercy that granted quicker death. But the execution was still traumatic for family and supporters. Your estates were confiscated, your family disgraced, your name became warning to others. Major noble rebellions in England, like the Revolt of 1215 that produced Magna Carta or the Wars of the Roses, resulted in numerous noble executions. Political miscalculation or backing the wrong faction could mean the reading material that circulated among literate nobles included chivalric romances, chronicles, classical texts, and religious works. These shaped how nobles understood their world and their roles. The Arthurian legends presented idealized version of knighthood that influenced real nobles' behavior, sometimes positively, encouraging courage and honor, sometimes disastrously, promoting unrealistic expectations. The chronicles that recorded history were often partisan, glorifying some rulers while vilifying others. You read these texts and absorbed worldview that justified social hierarchy and noble privilege. The artistic patronage that wealthy nobles provided supported painters, sculptors, and artisans, commissioning artworks, religious paintings, sculptures, illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, demonstrated wealth and piety. The artworks served partly as decoration, but primarily as displays of status and religious devotion. You commissioned pieces that glorified your family, depicted biblical scenes, or portrayed you in favorable light. Supporting artists was expected of wealthy nobles, and failure to do so suggested either poverty or poor taste. The architectural projects that nobles funded included churches, monasteries, and improvements to castles. Building in stone was expensive, requiring skilled masons, expensive materials, and years of work. A major building project could consume substantial portion of your wealth, but the completed structure lasted centuries and bore your name as founder. The Gothic cathedrals that still impress modern visitors were funded by nobles and wealthy merchants seeking to glorify God and themselves simultaneously. The wine cellars that well-appointed castles possessed stored wine in barrels and bottles, but storage was imperfect. Wine oxidized, developed off flavors, or turned to vinegar. Managing wine supply meant constantly replacing spoiled stocks and calculating how much to store for future needs. The cellars also stored preserved foods, salted meat, pickled vegetables, dried fruits, which required protection from rats and moisture. Your wealth meant you had more stored food than peasants, but abundance didn't guarantee quality or preservation. The traveling that you did was arduous and dangerous. Medieval roads were poor, muddy in rain, dusty in summer, often just dirt tracks. Your travels by horse or in carriages were slow, uncomfortable, and exposed you to bandits. Accommodations en route meant staying at monasteries, other nobles' estates, or rough inns with minimal comfort. You traveled with retinue of servants and guards for protection and assistance. A journey of 100 miles might take a week or more. Long-distance travel was rare and undertaken only when necessary. The justice that you administered on your estates gave you power over your peasants' lives. You held manorial courts where disputes were settled, crimes judged, and punishments assigned. You could fine, imprison, or corporally punish those who violated your rules. This power was both responsibility and potential for abuse. Some lords were fair arbiters. Others were tyrants who exploited their judicial authority for personal gain. Your peasants had limited recourse if you were unjust. Appealing to higher authority was difficult and risky. The tithes that you collected from peasants, 10% of their produce owed to the church but often collected by nobles who held ecclesiastical rights, added to your income, but also created resentment. Peasants struggling to feed their families had to surrender portion of their harvest. You enforced collection because it was profitable, but it made you unpopular. The social tensions between lords and peasants occasionally exploded into rebellions, like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where accumulated grievances led to violence against nobles. The climate during the medieval period fluctuated, with the medieval warm period, roughly 950–1250, giving way to the Little Ice Age starting around 1300. The cooler, wetter weather of the Little Ice Age reduced crop yields, caused famines, and made life harder, even for the wealthy. The Great Famine of 1315 killed millions across Europe. Even nobles suffered from food shortages, though not as severely as peasants. Your wealth couldn't control the weather, and prolonged bad harvests reduced the income from your estates while increasing prices for what food was available. The horses that were essential to noble life required substantial investment. War horses, destriers, cost enormous sums, perhaps equivalent to several years of a skilled artisan's wages. Maintaining horses meant providing fodder, stabling, grooming, and medical care. A large noble household might have dozens of horses for different purposes: war horses, riding horses, draft horses. The expense was considerable, but necessary because horses were both transportation and military equipment. Losing a valuable horse in battle or to disease was significant financial loss. The armor that you wore in battle was expensive custom-fitted equipment. A full suit of plate armor in the 15th century cost perhaps 16, roughly equal to skilled craftsmen's annual wage. The armor had to be maintained, repaired after battles, and eventually replaced as it wore out or as you outgrew it. Armor was investment that proclaimed your status, but also protected your life. The poorest knights wore less complete armor and were more vulnerable in battle. Your armor quality could mean the difference between surviving a fight and dying from a sword stroke. The falsehoods that medieval period has generated in popular culture include many myths about noble life. The droit du seigneur, right of the lord to sleep with peasant brides on wedding nights, was not widespread practice and likely didn't exist in systematic way. It's mostly literary invention. The chastity belts supposedly used by knights going on crusade are largely myth. The few examples that exist were Victorian fabrications. The image of knights constantly engaged in romantic quests is fantasy. Understanding real medieval life requires stripping away these later inventions. The hygiene practices of medieval nobles were better than popular myth suggests, but still inadequate by modern standards. You washed your hands before meals. This was expected courtesy. You might bathe a few times per year in a wooden tub filled with heated water. But daily bathing wasn't practiced. It was considered unhealthy by medieval medical theory. You used perfumes and scented oils to mask body odor. Your clothes were cleaned occasionally, but not frequently. The overall standard of cleanliness was low, and everyone smelled of sweat and other odors that would be unacceptable today. The furniture in your castle was sparse and uncomfortable. You had wooden benches and chairs in the great hall, a table for dining, perhaps a throne-like chair for formal occasions. Your bed was wooden frame with mattress stuffed with straw or feathers, covered with linens and furs. The mattresses were uncomfortable by modern standards and harbored bedbugs and fleas. You had chests for storing clothes and valuables, no closets or dressers. The rooms were drafty and cold, and the sparse furniture did little to make them comfortable. Your wealth bought you more furniture than peasants had, but comfort remained elusive. The windows in your castle were small to maintain defensive strength and to retain heat. Glass windows were expensive luxury. Most castles had wooden shutters or oiled parchment covering window openings. The shutters kept out weather, but also blocked light. So your choice was between being cold with some light or being warmer, but in darkness. Glass windows, when you could afford them, were made of small panes set in lead frames. The glass was imperfect, bubbly, discolored, with irregular thickness, but it allowed light while keeping out weather. Only the wealthiest nobles had significant glass windows. The inheritance laws that governed property transfer varied by region, but generally favored primogeniture. Eldest son inherited everything. This preserved estates intact, but left younger sons with little. Younger sons might enter the church, might seek their fortune in warfare, or might marry heiresses. Your younger sons had to find their own paths to wealth and status, which created family tensions. Daughters were married off with dowries. Your dynastic planning involved calculating how to provide for all your children while preserving the family estates for your primary heir. The concept of nobility itself evolved during the medieval period. Early medieval nobles were primarily warrior leaders. Their status came from military prowess and land control. By later Middle Ages, nobility had become more hereditary and bureaucratic. Being noble meant having proper lineage, observing codes of conduct, and maintaining lifestyle that proclaimed your status. The boundaries between noble and non-noble were somewhat permeable. Wealthy merchants could sometimes purchase nobility. Successful knights could be elevated, but social mobility was limited and suspicious. True nobility was seen as inherent quality, not just wealth. The end of the medieval period, roughly the late 15th century, saw changes that transformed noble life. The rise of gunpowder made castles obsolete and changed warfare. The growth of centralized monarchies reduced nobles' independent power. The emergence of printing spread literacy and information. The discovery of the Americas opened new trade routes and sources of wealth. The Renaissance brought new cultural values that challenged medieval worldview. Your world as medieval noble was ending, though you might not have recognized how profound the changes would be. The comparison between medieval wealth and modern wealth reveals how dramatically quality of life has improved even for average people today. A medieval noble had servants, land, and social status, but lived without running water, central heating, effective medicine, or any of the technologies that make modern life comfortable. A middle-class person today enjoys conveniences, hot showers, refrigeration, air conditioning, antibiotics, rapid transportation that were literally impossible in the Middle Ages. The wealth that mattered most historically was access to technology and knowledge, not just money and social status. The religious worldview that shaped medieval nobles' understanding of their privilege taught that social hierarchy was divinely ordained. You were born noble because God had chosen your family for that role. Peasants were born to labor because that was God's plan. This worldview justified inequality and made acceptance of one's station a religious duty. Questioning the social order was not just politically dangerous, but spiritually suspect. You maintained your wealth and privilege partly through force, but largely through an ideology that convinced everyone, including peasants, that inequality was natural and right. The crusading ideal that motivated many nobles combined genuine religious fervor with less spiritual motivations. Going on crusade meant fighting for Christendom, securing spiritual merit, and potentially earning earthly rewards. But crusades were also expensive, dangerous, and often futile. The Fourth Crusade famously sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, in 1204, instead of fighting Muslims, showing how crusading ideals could be corrupted by practical considerations and greed. Your decision to crusade involved calculating religious benefits, political advantages, and risks to life and fortune. The pilgrimage sites that attracted noble visitors included Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and Canterbury. Making pilgrimage was act of piety that could reduce time in purgatory and demonstrate devotion. But pilgrimages were expensive and dangerous journeys lasting months or years. You traveled with servants and guards, stayed at monasteries and inns along established pilgrimage routes, and bought relics and souvenirs to bring home. The journey was spiritually meaningful, but also uncomfortable ordeal involving long days of travel, inadequate food, and risk of robbery or disease. The relics that you collected or venerated were believed to have miraculous powers. A piece of the true cross, a saint's bone, or a fragment of holy person's clothing were treasures that attracted pilgrims and demonstrated your piety. Some relics were genuine ancient objects. Many were fraudulent. The medieval period saw brisk trade in fake relics, with enough pieces of the true cross circulating to build several crosses. But authenticity mattered less than belief. If people believed a relic was genuine, it had power regardless of its actual origin. The monasteries that you supported or might retire to represent a different model of life than secular nobility. Monasteries valued poverty, chastity, and obedience, direct contradictions to noble values of wealth, family continuation, and authority. But monasteries also preserved learning, provided hospitality, and offered spiritual services. You donated to monasteries because it was expected and because monks prayed for your soul. The relationship between secular nobles and religious communities was symbiotic. You provided material support, they provided spiritual benefits and legitimacy. The music that enriched noble life included both sacred and secular forms. Church services featured Gregorian chant and increasingly complex polyphonic music. Secular entertainment included songs by troubadours and minstrels, love songs, martial ballads, satirical pieces. Musical instruments included lutes, harps, viols, and various wind instruments. You appreciated music as cultured noble, but the performances were live and ephemeral. No recordings existed to preserve or replay them. Each performance was unique and then gone forever. The dance that formed part of courtly entertainment was formal and symbolic rather than spontaneous. Medieval dances had complex steps and patterns that demonstrated grace and breeding. You danced at festivals and celebrations, performing choreographed movements that expressed social relationships and hierarchies. The dances weren't primarily about enjoyment, but about displaying proper behavior and social status. A noble who danced clumsily damaged their reputation. Dance was another arena where you performed your identity as noble person. The astronomy and astrology that educated nobles studied were intertwined disciplines. You believed that stars and planets influenced earthly events and human personalities. Astrologers cast horoscopes predicting future events or advising on auspicious times for important actions. The science was a mixture of observation and superstition. Some astronomical predictions, eclipses, planetary positions, were accurate, while astrological predictions were unfalsifiable mysticism. But the boundary between science and magic was blurry in medieval thought, and you consulted astrologers when making important decisions. The alchemy that some nobles pursued combined early chemistry with mystical philosophy. Alchemists sought the philosopher's stone that could transmute base metals into gold and produce elixir of life, granting immortality. These goals were impossible, but alchemical experiments developed useful chemical knowledge and techniques. If you funded alchemical research, you hoped for practical results, better metallurgy, useful medicines, even if the grand promises went unfulfilled. Alchemy attracted both serious scholars and charlatans, and distinguishing between them was difficult. The heraldry that identified your family was a complex symbolic system with specific rules. Your coat of arms displayed colors, shapes, and charges, symbols that represented your lineage and achievements. Heralds were officials who recorded and regulated heraldic symbols, ensuring that each noble family had unique arms. Your heraldic symbols appeared on shields, banners, seals, and possessions. They were your brand identity in an era before mass literacy. Understanding heraldry was essential social knowledge for nobles, and failure to display your arms correctly suggested ignorance or low status. The tournaments that evolved from martial training into elaborate spectacles demonstrated noble culture at its most theatrical. By the late Middle Ages, tournaments were carefully orchestrated events with formal protocols, elaborate costumes, and relatively reduced violence, though injuries and deaths still occurred. You participated in tournaments partly to demonstrate martial skills, but primarily to perform your role as noble knight. The pageantry, colorful tents, decorated horses, elaborate armor, ladies granting favors, created theatrical space where noble ideals were enacted even as the reality of warfare became increasingly brutal and unchivalric. The decline of chivalric ideals in the late Middle Ages reflected changing military and social realities. Gunpowder weapons made knightly armor less effective. Professional armies of common soldiers replaced feudal levies of knights. The code of chivalry that supposedly governed noble conduct was revealed as selective, applied among nobles, but routinely violated against commoners. Your grandfather might have sincerely believed in chivalric values, but by your time, chivalry was becoming nostalgia for an idealized past rather than living practice. The gap between chivalric ideals and brutal reality of late medieval warfare was too obvious to ignore. The peasant revolts that occasionally erupted demonstrated the limits of noble power. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1398, and numerous smaller uprisings showed that peasants could organize resistance to noble authority. These revolts were usually suppressed brutally, with rebel leaders executed and villages punished. But the revolts also demonstrated that noble power rested partly on peasant acceptance. If peasants refused to work or pay rents en masse, noble wealth evaporated. The revolts were frightening reminders that the social order you benefited from was maintained through force and ideology, not natural law. The witch hunts that began in late medieval period and intensified in early modern era showed dark side of religious authority. Women, and some men, accused of witchcraft, often based on neighbor disputes, personal grudges, or hysteria, faced torture and execution. As noble with judicial authority, you might be involved in witch trials. The theological reasoning held that witches made pacts with the devil and caused harm through magic. The evidence was often confessions extracted through torture. The witch hunts reveal how religious belief could justify terrible injustices and how those with power could eliminate inconvenient people through accusations of supernatural crimes. The printing press invented by Gutenberg in the 1450s began to transform how knowledge circulated, though the impact took decades to fully manifest. If you were noble in the late 15th century, you might have seen printed books, cheaper than manuscripts, more numerous, and identical rather than each being unique copy. The printing revolution eventually democratized knowledge and reduced nobles' monopoly on literacy and learning. But in your lifetime, printed books were still relatively expensive and rare, and their world-changing potential was not yet obvious. The gunpowder weapons that transformed warfare in the late medieval period made traditional noble military advantages obsolete. A peasant with a gun could kill an armored knight from distance with minimal training. The longbow had already demonstrated that common soldiers could defeat knights, but guns were even more devastating. Your expensive armor, years of training, and chivalric ideals were increasingly irrelevant on battlefields where anonymous projectiles killed indiscriminately. The military basis of noble power was crumbling, though the social and economic power of nobility persisted for centuries more. The transition from medieval to early modern period saw nobles adapting to changed circumstances. Some became courtiers and administrators in centralized monarchies. Some became entrepreneurs, investing in trade and manufacturing. Some clung to old ways and declined into genteel poverty. If you were forward-looking noble, you recognized that the world was changing and adapting. If you were conservative, you insisted on traditional privileges and prerogatives even as they became less sustainable. The nobility as a class survived into modern era, but the power and lifestyle of medieval nobles ended as the Middle Ages did. The legacy of medieval nobility includes both positive and negative elements. Noble patronage supported art, architecture, literature, and learning that enriched European culture. The ideals of chivalry, however imperfectly realized, promoted values of honor, courage, and service that influenced later ethical codes. But noble privilege was also built on exploitation of peasants, monopolization of land and resources, and violence to maintain power. The castles and cathedrals that tourists admire today were built with peasant labor and financed by wealth extracted from people who lived in poverty. Understanding medieval nobility honestly requires acknowledging both their cultural contributions and their role as exploiters. The romanticism that surrounds medieval nobility in modern popular culture is largely fantasy projection. Movies and novels depict noble life as exciting adventure filled with tournaments, romance, and heroic deeds. The reality was far more mundane, managing estates, dealing with legal disputes, arranging marriages, worrying about money, and dying young from diseases or violence. The fantasy appeals because it offers escape into a world that seems simpler and more meaningful than modern life. But the medieval nobles themselves often expressed frustration with their circumstances and would likely have preferred modern comforts over their drafty castles. The question of whether you would actually want to be a wealthy medieval noble given the choice has clear answer. Probably not. The wealth brought power, status, and better conditions than peasants endured, but it couldn't buy the comforts and security that even average modern people enjoy. You would die younger than modern people, even with the best medieval medical care. You would live in physical discomfort, cold, poor sanitation, inadequate lighting, that modern people would find intolerable. You would face constant threats, disease, violence, political intrigue that would create chronic stress and anxiety. The specific examples of medieval nobles' lives from historical records reveal both the privileges and the problems. Edward the Friar of England, 1239 by 1307, was one of the most powerful men in Europe, yet he suffered from illness throughout his life and died at age 68 after years of physical decline. Eleanor of Aquitaine, 1122–1204, was queen consort of both France and England, immensely wealthy and politically powerful, yet she was imprisoned by her husband for 16 years and saw several of her children die. These were among the most privileged people of their era, yet their lives included substantial suffering that wealth couldn't prevent. The archaeological evidence from medieval castles and manor houses reveals the material reality of noble life. Excavations find evidence of poor sanitation, minimal heating, inadequate lighting, and cramped living conditions, even in wealthy households. The artifacts show that nobles owned beautiful objects, jewelry, decorated weapons, fine pottery, but lived in environments that were cold, dark, and uncomfortable. The bones of medieval nobles show evidence of arthritis, dental disease, injuries from warfare and accidents, and nutritional deficiencies, despite adequate food supplies. The physical evidence confirms what written sources suggest. Wealth provided advantages, but couldn't overcome the harsh realities of medieval life. The account books that survive from noble households reveal the economics of maintaining status. The Earl of Northumberland's household accounts from 1512 show expenditures on food, clothing, servants' wages, and maintaining the castle that consumed nearly all the Earl's income. The accounts reveal that even wealthy nobles lived on edge of financial trouble, constantly juggling expenses and revenues. The accounts also show the massive number of people employed by noble households. Dozens of servants consuming resources but necessary to maintain appropriate status. The letters that survive from medieval nobles reveal their emotional lives and concerns. The Paston letters from 15th century England show a gentry family dealing with legal disputes, arranged marriages, political upheavals, and financial troubles. The letters reveal that nobles had the same range of emotions as modern people: love, anger, fear, ambition, but operating within very different social constraints. A Paston daughter's letter about her reluctance to marry a man she'd never met is a poignant reminder that arranged marriages created real human suffering even within privileged families. The wills that nobles left reveal their concerns about salvation and legacy. Nobles typically left substantial sums to churches and monasteries for prayers for their souls. They specified funeral arrangements, tomb locations, and masses to be said for their eternal rest. The wills also divided property among heirs and sometimes revealed family tensions, disinherited children, favorite illegitimate offspring, and disputes anticipated even after death. The wills show that medieval nobles were preoccupied with both their soul's fate and their families' futures. The chroniclers who recorded noble deeds often exaggerated their subjects' virtues while minimizing flaws. Medieval chronicles praised nobles who were generous patrons of the chronicler or their monastery, while condemning those who were enemies. The accounts can't be taken at face value. They're propaganda as much as history. Understanding real medieval nobles requires reading chronicles critically, recognizing biases, and comparing multiple sources. The idealized portraits in chronicles tell us how nobles wanted to be remembered, not necessarily how they actually lived. The artistic representations of nobles in medieval art show them as they wished to be seen: pious, powerful, refined. The tomb sculptures present nobles as idealized figures, often younger and more handsome than they were in life. The illuminated manuscripts show nobles engaged in hunts, feasts, and religious devotions, the activities that displayed status. The art is valuable evidence of noble culture, but must be understood as aspirational representation rather than documentary record. The art shows how nobles wanted to be perceived, which reveals their values even if it doesn't show reality. The evolution of noble identity over the medieval period reflected changing political and economic circumstances. Early medieval nobles were essentially warlords who controlled territory through military might. By the High Middle Ages, nobility had become more hereditary and institutionalized, with legal definitions of who counted as noble. By the late Middle Ages, nobles were increasingly integrated into royal bureaucracies and commercial economies. The consistent element was that nobles claimed superior status based on birth, but what that status meant in practical terms changed considerably. The relationship between noble and royal authority was sometimes cooperative, sometimes kings needed nobles to govern their kingdoms, provide military forces, and maintain social order. Nobles needed royal favor to secure their positions and advance their interests. But kings and nobles also competed for power. Kings worked to centralize authority and reduce nobles' independence. Nobles resisted royal overreach and defended their traditional privileges. The tension between royal and noble power shaped medieval politics and sometimes exploded into civil wars like the Wars of the Roses. The interaction between Christian and Muslim worlds through crusades, trade, and cultural exchange influenced European nobles. The Crusades brought European nobles into contact with Islamic civilization, which was in many ways more advanced than medieval Christendom. Islamic medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and technology influenced European development. Some crusaders adopted Eastern customs, better hygiene, different clothing, new foods. But the dominant European attitude was hostility and the belief in Christian superiority. The cultural exchange was limited by religious antagonism, even when practical benefits were obvious. The Jewish communities in medieval Europe had complex relationships with Christian nobles. Jews provided financial services, money lending, that Christians were forbidden by church law from providing. Nobles borrowed from Jewish lenders and sometimes relied on them for financial advice. But Jews were also scapegoated during crises, subjected to discriminatory laws, and periodically expelled or massacred. As noble, you might have protected Jewish communities in your territory because they were economically valuable, while also participating in the prejudices and persecutions that made Jewish life precarious. The relationship was characterized by exploitation and intermittent the different regions of medieval Europe developed distinctive noble cultures. French nobles emphasized chivalric ideals and courtly culture. English nobles focused on legal rights and parliamentary representation. German nobles were fragmented among countless principalities with varying local customs. Italian nobles in city-states like Venice and Florence combined noble status with commercial activities that northern nobles would have considered beneath their dignity. Spanish nobles, influenced by centuries of reconquista against Muslim rulers, developed militant crusading culture. The common elements of nobility existed across Europe, but regional variations were substantial. The technological innovations that emerged during the medieval period, windmills, watermills, improved plows, horse collars, increased agricultural productivity. As noble controlling estates, you benefited from these improvements because they increased the food surplus that your peasants produced, and you extracted. But you probably didn't personally innovate. Nobles weren't typically inventors or engineers. You adopted innovations that others developed, or more often, you resisted innovations that threatened traditional arrangements. Conservative attachment to customary practices often slowed technological adoption on noble estates. The educational institutions that emerged in the medieval period, universities at Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and elsewhere, were primarily for training clergy and lawyers, not nobles. Some nobles' younger sons attended universities if they were entering church careers, but most nobles received practical education at home or in other nobles' households. The university curriculum focused on theology, law, and classical texts, valuable knowledge but not immediately practical for managing estates or leading troops. University education became more valued by nobles in later periods, but during most of the Middle Ages, nobles viewed universities as institutions for clerics, not warriors. The languages that nobles spoke varied by region and social context. You spoke the vernacular language of your region, French, English, German, Spanish, in daily life. But Latin was the language of church, law, and international diplomacy. Educated nobles could read and write Latin and might use it for correspondence with other nobles or clergy. The vernacular languages were developing literary traditions during the medieval period, producing works like Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and the Arthurian romances. Your ability to appreciate this literature marked you as cultured person, even as the literary themes of courtly love and chivalric adventure bore limited resemblance to your actual life. So the next time you watch a movie or read a novel about medieval nobility, seeing the grand castles, the elaborate feasts, the romantic tournaments, remember the reality. The lord shivering in his cold stone castle despite wearing furs, the lady who lost 3 children to diseases turned 5, the knight who died from an infected wound that antibiotics could have cured, and the wealthy merchant whose fortune couldn't buy him clean water or save his wife from childbirth complications. Remember that being rich in the Middle Ages meant having more than peasants, but still enduring conditions that any modern person would find intolerable. Being wealthy in the Middle Ages wasn't the romantic privilege that popular culture portrays. The advantages were real: better food, more space, social status, and power over others. But wealth couldn't overcome the fundamental problems of the era. Disease killed indiscriminately. Violence threatened constantly, comfort was impossible to achieve, and medical care was useless or harmful. The castles were cold and damp. The food was heavy and monotonous. The marriages were arranged for politics, not love, and the average noble died decades younger than modern people, despite every advantage medieval society could provide. And so ends our journey through medieval nobility. If you enjoyed this exploration of the reality behind the romantic myth, subscribe for more journeys revealing historical truths. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of noble life surprised you most, or suggest another topic you'd like me to explore. Sleep well, time traveler, and maybe tonight appreciate that you have running water, central heating, antibiotics, anesthesia, and electricity, comforts that no medieval noble, however wealthy, could enjoy. Appreciate that you can marry for love, that your children will probably survive to adulthood, that minor wounds won't kill you, and that dental pain is treatable rather than permanent. Appreciate that modernity, for all its problems, has given average people a quality of life that medieval kings could only dream of. And remember that the castles and cathedrals we admire today were built by the labor of people who lived in grinding poverty, so that the wealthy few could live in merely uncomfortable privilege. Sweet dreams.